Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings. My guest for this program is my friend and colleague, Mr. Micah Hanks. Micah is, he's just one of the major voices in the intellectual aspects of the UFO phenomenon, in my opinion. He's the author of UFOs and the Singularity and other books, too. I don't actually have all of Micah's books, but maybe we'll talk about that at some point. But Micah is very well known, and he is a host on KGRA. He's had his own show, the Gralien Report, for many, many years. He has his own website. We can talk about that too. But Micah, it is good to have you here, my friend. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Good to be here, drinking more coffee than I should probably be allowed to. And if certain people had their way, I wouldn't be allowed to, right?
Is coffee one of the things on the restricted list now?
I'm just counting the days. I'm waiting for it. There's going to be some mandate that comes down from, top brass, and they're going to tell me I can no longer have as much coffee as I enjoy drinking. Hey, the conflicting studies, though. Every other day it's either it's too much is too bad, or, you can't have enough. It's all good for you, antioxidant rich. So I'm just going to enjoy myself.
That's really true. That's really true.
Yeah.
You're jumping the gun a little bit, because we had a little bit of a chat before we went on about what we were going to get into. And, I think most listeners are familiar with who you are. And we certainly can get into some matters pertaining to the UFO subject and whatever is related. We have a couple of things in mind. But we were going to get into the cultural zeitgeist during this chat. And I think you were kind of giving a heads up about that, unless I'm reading that wrong.
No, you read me correctly. And I always advise that when people hear me talk, that they try to read, it's the deeper nuances of writing. You read like the quick and the certain brevity, I think, of writers like, even Ernest Hemingway, know that journalistic brevity. And yet, again, there was a depth to his writing. So you should always be on the lookout. But that's really kind of the whole thing about the cultural zeitgeist anyway. There's an undercurrent that many people aren't paying attention to or even aware of, which is why I actually enjoy talking about that subject with you as much as UFOs or anything else. So let's get into it.
Well, we will. I want to get into first really I think what is gaining traction is the leading sort of issue of drama in the UFO field these days. I've heard a lot of people discussing it. I just been chatting about it a little bit. And that's the whole trademark issue of the phrase secret space program by Corey Goode and the actual acronym SSP, as well as trademarking a number of other items in association with his public image. So Blue Avian, Sphere Being Alliance, I think, and the acronym Sphere SBA, I suppose, which I actually thought stood for Small Business Association, but now it's Sphere Being Alliance. And my take on this is that it's actually a really bad development. Even the thought that one could trademark a phrase like secret space program or an acronym SSP, I just think, you have got to be kidding me that you think you can do this and get away with it. All of this happened in connection with basically his war with Gaia, and over the fact that he and David Wilcock have left Gaia. Clearly, they've left it for what they perceive to be greener pastures elsewhere. And you can see this is all about money, but nonetheless, the whole idea of trademarking it, I think, is a very pernicious, really bad development. But I'm sure you've got your thoughts on it. So what do you think about all of this?
Well, you said you've got to be kidding me. And, as it relates to a lot of these people, especially Corey Goode, that's kind of what I thought he was doing all along. Okay? Kidding us?
Well,
right? It was a joke, wasn't it?
The thing, I don't want to take your time away here, but you gave me the opening.
Oh, yeah.
I would just say, and he's not the first. There have been a lot of other people who have been portraying themselves as whistleblowers, who've talked about the secret space program, and but they do it in ways that are so incredibly fantastic and Hollywood-esque that it really does defy credence, and it defies any kind of common sense and logic. And of course, they always have this way of turning themselves into these great hero type figures, So I think we need to be very, very careful about it. And you can't test any of this. All of this is just out there, and it's just like, trust me, this is what it is. And I've gone to Antarctica, and I've gone to Mars, and I went for 20 years, and I came back, and I didn't age a day, and so forth. And it is shocking to me how people will just like gobble it up. Like I've felt like I've used the analogy, like if you had a next door neighbor who told you these stories, you'd say, well, that guy's crazy. But you put them in front of large audiences, and it's like they become hypnotized. I don't know. It is a crazy thing.
It's hard to make sense of, isn't it? I look at this broader thing, and I don't know. I mean, for me, I always try to, I guess I abide by the thumper rule. If you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. And so I don't like to be a person who just attacks other people, but you get to a certain point where, for lack of a better term, the bovine excrement just piles up so high, and it's just so cumbersome that you really are kind of forced into action, right? And I think that's why we're talking about this, because I don't really put much stock in the things that guys like Corey Goode say. And I was recently at an event out in Wyoming where that subject in the secret space program thing came up, and we were kind of doing a little, we were live streaming on the web and talking about this. And I mean, I spoke fairly passionately about this, as many of the other speakers and panelists did. We don't think that does a service to serious discussion about unusual things that appear to be going on, to which, in my personal opinion, you know this from talking with me over the years, Richard, I think if ufology or UAP is to move forward, there has to be a historical and also an advocacy element to it in relation to government and research into historical documentation. There has to be a very practical-minded attitude with regard to the idea that secrecy is a real element to this. But there also has to be a scientific attitude. And I make a distinction between the historical research and the scientific research, because there are a lot more people, and sometimes scientists like Stanton Friedman and historians like yourself, who have done historical research, but people who, like maybe Bruce Maccabee and a few others, who have actually put scientific inquiry on a civilian level behind this subject. I mean, they're few and far between.
It's true.
And so there needs to be a multifaceted approach to the study of this in every mode of serious intellectual inquiry that can be taken about. Then somebody comes along and says, and I've been to Mars, and I worked for the government. The blue avians are real. I've time traveled. My age was regressed, and now I'm much older than I really appear to be, but I look younger because of this or that. I mean,
right.
This is fantasy, folks. This is, and it's sad that we have to come out and say that it's fantasy. It should be evident. These truths should be self-evident, right? But apparently to some folks they are not. And the fact that there is a monetization element behind this, where we're going to try and trademark certain terms, which again are intellectual property, if anything, but not the kind I think that somebody feels that they own or should need to protect. I mean, last time I checked, this was a concept in a broader narrative pertaining to possible theories about the so-called UFO phenomena.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it troubles me, like you said, that somebody thinks that this needs to be trademarked because of two things. One, it definitely to me points to a monetization or an economic interest behind it all, and that to me is preeminent with certain characters. But two, there is also an attempt at actually placing restrictions on discussion of said content in the first place, which is perhaps an even bigger problem.
Yes, in fact, I could not agree more with you. I don't really have a problem with anyone wanting to monetize pretty much anything. I'm a real believer in classical free enterprise. Like, you should be free to engage in the enterprise of your choosing and make your money the way you want to make your money. That's fine. And if you want to even do it in a way that's a little bit sleazy, I mean, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I'm also saying people do that. We had P.T. Barnum 150 years ago, and what was his phrase? There's a sucker born every minute. Well, that's life. But what I do have a problem with is when someone wants to monetize a field where we're trying to do serious work, and that act of monetization is basically just leaving a big pile of garbage and litter all over the area where we're trying to work. It makes it that much more difficult. So no, I don't appreciate that. The other thing I just want to, I was thinking of when you were talking, is the amount of time wasted on these types of discussions. Remember in the lead up to 2012 when you had so many people, particularly in the New Age community, that were talking about the coming ascension, and how much time was spent on that whole thing. And then remember in I think it was 2011, Richard Hoagland particularly was pushing the idea of the comet Elenine as a spaceship, or it was actually Nibiru or Planet X coming to Earth. And I distinctly remember for about 6 months, much of the UFO community was losing it over this, over what they thought was Nibiru coming to Earth. And of course, nothing happened. Obviously, nothing happened. And I just think of events like this as so much wasted time, wasted energy. And now with the Corey Goode phenomenon, promoted by David Wilcock, this just never seems to go away. It's just here. This is the latest iteration. And maybe one day this will pass, and the next thing you know, there'll be someone else. And there's other so-called whistleblowers. You have Emery Smith, now Jason Rice, who I haven't really delved into Jason Rice yet. I understand he took a polygraph, but that means nothing to me, to be honest with you. Polygraphs these days are, I honestly have no idea how accurate or comprehensive they really are, or what was the nature of his particular polygraph. I don't know. So there's just more and more of these people who come out, and it's like we're just spinning our wheels. I've really entertained to what extent this can be an active disinformation ploy, but of course, how can I have proof one way or the other?
That's a good point. And, again, there's a part of me that says, why justify this silliness with discussion at all? But I mean, generally, I don't even talk about these kind of things. On my program, I'm preeminently focused on science as it relates to the unexplained. Yeah. And I also do a political program, which we've had you on in the past, Middle Theory. I'm looking at these kind of events and the things that are important. But in the context of a discussion like this, I think it is actually important at least to kind of outline the similarity as you were kind of getting into right there. You tied in with the 2012 frenzy and, Richard Hoagland and people like that promoting the old ideas like Nibiru and things like that, which really goes all the way back to, certain names like Zecharia Sitchin. And
right.
Again, I've read a lot of scholarly books and other material that focus on, for instance, the idea of belief and the religiousness that becomes appended to UFO cult-like.
Yes.
And actually, not even just cult-like. Sometimes there are actual cults that are operative with this weird UFO belief. I mean, for instance, Bob Applewhite and the Heaven's Gate thing. People are always asking me, Micah, do you know anything about Bob Applewhite? Have you listened to this podcast? And I'm thinking, man, first of all, if you really seriously study the history of UFOs, not only will you know about that, but if you've ever sat down and had breakfast with Peter Robbins, you've heard his first stories.
Bob Applewhite or Marshall Applewhite? Isn't it Marshall?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, yeah, I believe it was Marshall.
Marshall Applewhite.
Yeah, and they, that's right. They show up at a book signing. You remember that Peter Robbins had done. I mean, again.
Oh, yes. I have a vague memory. I think Peter told me this, but you probably remember this better than I do.
I mean, very briefly to paraphrase, I mean, his book Left at East Gate had come out, and he and his co-author were actually doing a book signing, and he said that these two strange individuals showed up and asked if they would, have their books signed, and of course he said, who can, or inscribed, I think, and he said, who can I make it out to, and of course it was the Applewhites. So
this is in 1997, like right before everything happened.
Right before exactly. But see, a lot of people got onto Art Bell when that all went down because Art Bell had been talking on his program about this weird idea that was it the Hale-Bopp comet? Was it the one?
Correct. Hale-Bopp and the Heaven's Gate cult. This is 1997, led by Marshall Applewhite and his wife, I believe. Were convinced that this was an alien craft. In fact, Courtney Brown helped promote that theory, very much so. They believed it was a spaceship, and somehow you have this mass suicide so that they could, I guess, ascend or join the craft.
Well,
right?
See, a lot of people, again, had bought into the hype because anytime a comet comes around, anytime you've got something like a date like, 2012, where you can associate something like the Mayan calendar ending, anything that is of an eschatological kind of way of thinking, and that, again, eschatology, just essentially, the science of ultimates, the science of the end, all these kind of things, borrowing from the Greek. I mean, if there is a doomsday angle that can be applied to it that is sensationalized, people will get on board and it will become a social movement. We've seen this. Heck, you don't even have to have UFOs attached to it. Y2K was a great example. You remember that?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Actually, what you really have me thinking here is you mentioned eschatology, but there's intimately connected to that is a kind of utopianism. So you have this utopianism that definitely pervaded the Heaven's Gate cult. In other words, this idea that we can achieve, the perfect existence with our extraterrestrial brothers. Utopianism has pervaded the UFO subculture since the beginning, back in the 1950s with having contact with our alien space brothers who are going to liberate us from our puny and violent Earth ways and so forth. And that has never gone away. That's always been a sub-theme of the UFO phenomenon, this idea that we are going to be helped by the galactic community. There's even a utopianism in the disclosure community. If only we get disclosure, then we can release the technologies and make our society a beautiful, wonderful place. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to make the world a better place, but I would also say there's always this danger and this belief that you can really radically remake human society to achieve a kind of something very, very different than what we have been for thousands and thousands of years. And so this utopianism to me is kind of related to the cultural zeitgeist we are in. And I am talking about some of the postmodernists and what we might call even the progressive left. And I'm not saying the left are the only ones guilty of utopianism, but this idea that we can kind of remake human society, we can reshape the human being into this mold rather than that mold. And that is a form of utopianism, and it really is something that is pervading our entire society, our entire, all of Western civilization, I think, is being infected by this kind of idea that we can just remake who we are. We can be, and the transhumanists are another version of this utopianism. You can live forever, you can live without disease. Well, that's probably a bad idea, ultimately, in my view, but we can get into that. But do you see where I'm going? I think that there's this, it's a dangerous idea that we can remake who we are, and therefore we're going to ban the old version of who we were, and we're going to only let this new version happen. Like, you can really see that. And then the only other thing I just want to say here, connecting this with the really, really pernicious attempt by Corey Goode to trademark SSP, Secret Space Program, and so on. This also seems to me 20, 30 years ago, if anyone had tried to do that, they would have been laughed out of the community. People would have said, are you kidding? Like, who the hell do you think you are that you can trademark a common phrase? What are you, like a patent troll? That's essentially what it sounds like. But we've had 20 years now, essentially, of a kind of postmodernist totalitarianism imposing itself on us, telling us, you're not allowed to say those words. You're not allowed to say these words. You're not allowed to say those words, or otherwise you're a bad person. You're not allowed to think these types of thoughts. You're not allowed to do this. And so we've now been beaten down to such an extent where when you get someone who's essentially a patent troll, in the modern patent troll, Corey Goode has become a patent troll, people just kind of shrug their shoulders, and it's like, oh, okay, so I'm not allowed to use Secret Space Program. That's his. In other words, we've had this idea of freedom of discourse and the freedom of speech beaten out of us by this postmodern virus. That's my take on it.
Yeah, and just before we get into postmodernism, because now that we're getting into that side of the discussion, that's something that really interests me, and it's really worthy of a discussion right here with you and I. But to tie a few of those things together, again, you mentioned going all the way back to the Space Brothers, 1950s and 60s. Guys like George Van Tassel, George Hunt Williamson, several of these so-called contactees who were claiming that they were having contact with people from outer space who were coming down. They suspiciously looked just like human beings and spoke either mentally or actual language verbally that we could understand. George Adamski is another one with Orthon. These beings were suspiciously from nearby planets, which now we know couldn't be inhabited, things like this. Corey Goode and these people, as it relates to the ongoing narrative of silliness in UFO circles, they are the latest iteration of that, and it shows that it's nothing new, and that, like you said, quoting again the great hucksters of yore, there's nothing new under the sun, and there's a sucker born every second. Somebody will believe these things, as they always have. Unfortunately, I think they always will, and that, my friend, is human nature, which brings us to the next element of discussion. There is sort of an idea these days that human nature and its fundamental tenets can be changed, if not through evolution or even conscious evolution, that they can be changed through force and through systematic kind of constraints placed on thought in our society.
Right.
That leads us to postmodernism. I'll ask, would you like my thoughts on that subject?
I want to hear it. I think listeners would like to hear this.
This is interesting because you brought to my attention a character who has become quite pivotal in the cultural dialogue as it relates to this, and that is one Jordan Peterson. Now,
right, I mentioned him to you some time ago. I said I really would like you to listen to this guy.
You did, and I had never heard of Jordan Peterson. Now, my take on him is that he has so many good ideas, and I love hearing him talk, but I do think at times he has allowed himself to become a little bit more polarizing politically than he necessarily should be or needs to be. Although I do think in defense of him that he has also been unfairly targeted by certain commentators and people of particular political ideologies as well. I think a lot of things he has said have been taken out of context too, but for all of these reasons, and I'm trying to approach this neutrally, for all of those reasons I became fascinated not just with him but with a broader movement that he's sort of become associated with, which is called collectively the intellectual dark web. Mm-hmm. That term was coined by Eric Weinstein, brother of Brett Weinstein, evolutionary biologist who was, again, got into a serious issue out there at Evergreen State College with regard to his opposition to a day of imposed segregation by the students. And it really became troubling to me when I began to see liberals, or not just liberals. I mean, Brett Weinstein is a very proud and vocal progressive liberal who are being, and a Jewish man too, who was called racist for opposing a day of imposed segregation on a college campus, one of the most liberal ones in North America. So that incident in itself was baffling, and it really was kind of a thermometer in the broader region of postmodernism to me. But then when you brought Jordan Peterson to my attention, I started seeing that there are other professors who have had similar problems, and agree or disagree with them, I think that's beside the point. What I want to try and understand is, what is it these people are doing? What is it that is so distasteful about them? What is postmodernism? And why do people like Peterson, who some identify as more right-wing, and Weinstein, he self-identifies as a progressive liberal, why do they both espouse a certain disdain for postmodernism? So,
they're not. These are not right-wing people in any common sense application of that term. So we have to put that out there. They are right wing only in the really warped postmodernist sense. So let's talk about what postmodernism is. I have a take of it. You have a take. Why don't you go? Describe.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I heard all of the aforementioned commentators, and let me throw a couple of others in there just so that we kind of know who we're discussing when we're talking about that so-called intellectual dark web. Sam Harris, again, a person who is an intellectual, an atheist, someone who probably wouldn't have a whole lot of time for discussion of subjects like UFOs. I don't know. I've never heard him talk about that. But again, somebody who, as a philosopher and a neuroscientist, he's a very serious skeptic and also a liberal, but nonetheless somebody who's been very attacked in terms of all of this broader political kind of discussion that we're having here. You've got Dave Rubin, you've got Joe Rogan is sort of associated with this, mostly because he has these kinds of commentators on his programs. I mentioned Brett Weinstein's brother, Eric Weinstein, who to me is just brilliant. Again, all of these kinds of individuals, what do they all share in common? They seem to want to be able to have honest, open dialogue and discussions. And fundamentally to that, it's not that they just want to discuss things that are unpopular sometimes. They really are advocates of free speech. Contrasting to that seems to be an element within the modern so-called postmodernism that is intolerant of discussion of certain ideas, which seems to be an imposition on or against free speech, according to those of the so-called intellectual dark web. So that brings us to your question, what is postmodernism? Mm-hmm. I, too, wanted to know, because I hear this conversation brought up all the time, and so I thought, well, what are we talking about here? So let's discuss it so people know. There is postmodernism in art. There is postmodernism in architecture. But really what we mean here is postmodernism in philosophy.
Yeah.
And it really stems from guys like Derrida, Michel Foucault.
Mm-hmm.
Foucault was interesting because he called himself more of a historian. But what he began looking at was, how in the past we could see that the progress that we saw in medical science, and this specifically with regard to mental hospitals, it didn't necessarily affect people who were being treated for the better. And so the postmodernist idea was one where he said, let us turn our lens of modernity back on the past and see what was modern at that time and considered good and progress, and see how it wasn't necessarily rather good for people who were affected by it. And we should look at ourselves today and say, despite all that we think we know, maybe things are relative in the sense that they appear to be good today and we think that we're on top of the game, but decades from now, we'll look back on the 21st century or the beginning of it and say, maybe we weren't, well, it was the 20th century when Foucault wrote this, but we'll look back and say, maybe we didn't know what we thought we knew. And maybe certain things we call truth are relative. This is key to understanding the idea of postmodernism, because it comes into this question of, well, what really is true? And you hear Sam Harris and people like that talk about this all the time. There was an entire episode of his podcast, Waking Up, where he and Jordan Peterson, did you hear this, Rich?
No.
God, you should listen to it.
I'm sure.
Everyone hated it. It's them. Okay, it's Peterson and Harris arguing for 2 hours about what truth is. And to me, everybody hated it, but I was like, this is brilliant. Everyone should listen to that podcast, because it shows, even among two guys who are critics of postmodernism, that there is a certain subjectivity of truth, which kind of points to the idea that there is a truth to the subjectivity of truth. I don't know that they would even dispute that.
I would just say, I think postmodernists do deny, essentially, in a way, they seem to deny that there is an actual truth that's meaningful in any sense. But I would disagree. People argue all the times over what happened on 9/11. There wouldn't be arguments over what happened on 9/11 if there wasn't an implicit understanding that something happened there that we need to understand and figure out, or any kind of historical reality. You wouldn't argue what really happened relating to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Like, there's always an implicit assumption that something did happen that would be the truth. Whether we can get to the truth is another issue, but
Exactly.
that there certainly is a truth. Now, I don't know if postmodernists even go in that direction, but
I think they do. And Richard, again, I'm with you, and I love how you kind of take it from a historical perspective, which fundamentally, I do too. Philosophy and history are really my two favorite things. Mm-hmm. And what we seem to be trying to argue here is that there is conceptually such a thing as a fundamental, irrefutable, universal truth. But it is opinion, and it is the limitations of knowledge that prevent us from reaching that truth, right? And so dialogue and discourse often is an attempt. We can philosophize all day and try and discuss a subject and say, well, what is the truth of this subject? That's why I've looked at the UFO phenomenon, by the way. Brief notes and asides here. I've looked at that as a philosopher, or from a philosophical perspective for years now, because to me, with UFOs, I recognize that, to me, there is some truth behind all this, but I don't have the full picture. And so the logistical problem with UFOs, or any subject, if we're trying to understand the truth in the context of this discussion about postmodernism, we have to be able to have the knowledge between point A and point B so that we can determine what that truth is. But there's always going to be a difference of opinion, which is really human nature. Now, in regard to that imposition on not just thought and discussion, but also really what it means to be human, this is where postmodernism in the modern sense seems to have kind of gotten really out of control. There not only are these ideas that, again, as Foucault later in his life began to write about, that, well, maybe gender is something that is sort of a construct, okay, a social construct, that these ideas, and we make a list of things that women are supposed to do in the home, well, those are things that society have imposed on the role of a woman, and therefore we can recognize that as a social construct. I can totally get behind that idea that male and female are social constructs, but when we start going to
not me. I won't get behind that idea, but anyway, continue.
Well, you might actually, and here's the funny thing. You're probably thinking, what did Micah just say? But now here's the deal. What I'm saying is that in Foucault's mind, the idea that the social construct were the list of ideas that have become associated with the role of a female, the gender role, versus the modern interpretation, which is that everybody is really gender fluid. You can be what you want to be, and we should stop giving children, gender-specific names. Now, that's where it's gotten out of hand, okay, to me.
Well, I think it got out of hand even before that.
Sure, yeah. And so,
I don't think that gender is a social construct. It doesn't mean that there are no social, that there isn't a social ideological element to how we understand gender. Boys are one way, girls are another way, and so forth. But there is absolutely scientifically verifiable biological foundations to gender. It is not an entirely social construct. It is not even primarily a social construct. It is primarily a biological construct. And I would argue that not simply in human beings, but in all of the animal kingdom.
No, you're correct. And again, I think the term I would use for what you're describing, though, is the sex of those specific members of said species. Gender, again, I think the postmodernists, when they attack that idea or call it a social construct, they mean the idea of the role of the sex. And see, this is the reason language is so important, though, because to you or I, one person we might say gender, and they'll say, well, that means either male or female, right? And another person says, well, no, that's the sex of the individual, right? Guys, that's the kind of problem. And I remember that Ludwig Wittgenstein, again, Ludwig Wittgenstein was described by Stephen Hawking, the late Sir Stephen Hawking, as the greatest philosopher of our age. And even that was a fairly subjective statement. And the funny thing is he quotes him in A Brief History of Time as saying that all that's left for philosophers to study is language. Well, first of all, he never really said that. We can't find the quote. We don't know what Stephen Hawking was paraphrasing or quoting when he said that in his book. But the reason I bring him up is because he was a brilliant philosopher of language. And if indeed it were true that all that was left for philosophers to try and tackle were the mysteries of language, right here we've just seen a great evidence of that. The idea that, well, one person may mean gender or another may mean sex. Guys, that's the whole problem, is we seem to be arguing about the different interpretation of terms and the fact that language is so damned arbitrary. One term may mean something different to another person. Talk about relativism. So to me, again, kind of trying to bring this subject back around, to me, that's kind of the problem, is that people are arguing about their not different opinions, but different interpretations of the same thing. And that's kind of the problem with postmodernism, and is the sense that we have gotten to a point where we take ideas to a level of abstraction that we don't even seem to remember what we were arguing about to begin with. And hence I see guys like Brett Weinstein, Jordan Peterson, and people kind of saying, look, we really do need to rein in on this and deal with the idea of truths. Sam Harris, again, I have to hand it to him. He is a person who fundamentally, with everything he does, tries to look at the nature of truth. And that's why it's important. But language is how we get there if we're going to discuss it verbally. And language, therefore, must be taken into consideration in relation to this broader subject. But again, I maintain that, I agree with you. The discussion has gotten a little crazy these days with regard to postmodernism, because people took things like what Foucault and Derrida were talking about, and I feel that they have at times taken them, two things, Rich, to illogical extremes, but also they have turned the argument and weaponized it in a way and toward what I would call authoritarian political correctness that has completely weaponized the discussion. And so now if you don't prescribe to certain ideas, if you don't prescribe to certain ideologies and don't use certain terminology, or rather if you choose to use certain terminology, you are therefore kind of blacklisted. Whether you're liberal, whether you're conservative, doesn't matter.
Oh, absolutely. There's a definite totalitarianism to this movement. Let's call it the left progressive, so-called progressive movement, that is influenced by a postmodernist philosophy that is deeply postmodernist. The one thing I just want to add here or say, you think of philosophers, right, and I'm using this phrase loosely, of Jacques Derrida, who I think is one of the most horrible obfuscators of the 20th century. I really think he is an absolutely terrible influence on modern intellectual life. But the thing about Derrida is he had this idea. He was known as a deconstructionist, which is a kind of variant of postmodernist thought. And the idea is, like, when you're looking at a text, a historical text in particular, but any kind of text, the idea is not to read it straight for what the author was trying to say. Like, you wouldn't read Shakespeare to understand the beauty and insight of what Shakespeare was trying to create. You try to get behind Shakespeare, and you try to analyze and break it down in terms of understanding structural hierarchy and power that's implicit in the writing of Shakespeare. And in other words, you deconstruct the text in a way that the author had absolutely no intention of being on board with. You just take the text. So you would write something, and then a deconstructionist would take what you write and interpret it in some radically different way, leaving you to say, wait, what are you talking about? That's not what I was talking about at all. And so what Derrida sort of trained an entire generation of scholars to do this. And what it's done is it's made our cultural narratives, our cultural discourse, there's this dishonesty about it, like where no one seems to be listening to each other. And we're at the point where today someone makes a statement, even in popular culture, it's leached in, where someone will say something and people will be so inclined not even to listen to the statement, but to say, who does he represent? What's this all about? What's he really trying to do? What's the actual meaning? Richard, rather than just listen to what people have to say. We don't do that anymore.
Let me make a comparison, just because I think you'll appreciate this. The Kathy Newman interview with Jordan Peterson.
Oh yeah. That's exactly what she did.
Exactly, yeah.
And she actually was turned into a meme. So what you're saying is, and then completely twisting what he says out of all reason. That was an extreme version, and we would definitely recommend people to go check that out. It's an epic. It's actually a modern classic. But yeah, that's what deconstructionism does. Deconstructionism and postmodernism, among many other evil things, has encouraged people really not to listen to someone else, but rather to deconstruct what you think they're actually saying. This is where we get into microaggressions. You could say something in a very nice way. Wow, you look really nice today. Well, that could be a microaggression, because they will interpret what they think you are saying or what they think you are implying, getting into all of this mystical, like what is this other person's intention? And so rather than actually just listening to what people are saying, and we've moved so far away. So that's a very great danger. That's one of many, many dangers that the postmodernists have done to our society. They've actually taught people not to listen to each other.
Well, two things. People have been taught that you can't just take what a person says at its face, and for the literal meaning of the words as the person intended it. It seems like there has to be this sort of this bizarre level of interpretation where there is a deeper symbolism behind everything.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's one thing to, I just forgive me here. It's one thing we all realize when people are having conversations. Yes, we get it. Everyone's got motivations for doing things. Not all of those motivations are open and overt. That's because we're human beings and we're complex creatures. But on the other hand, we're also speaking a common language, literally a common language, in our case, English, 21st century English, and that this is the mechanism by which we are attempting to communicate. And so it would be a tremendous disservice, I think, for me, if I were to say, well, Micah just said such and such, but what he really means is something totally different. And that's what postmodernism does. In other words, it really dissolves the common bond that we have of language itself as a unifier of our society. And it really undermines the trust that we have in our ability to communicate. I think it's a very dangerous philosophy.
Well, absolutely. And again, there's that old adage that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So again, I seem to recall reading Foucault talking about how toward the end of his life, he didn't like the fact that his writings had inspired the postmodern movement, and he didn't even agree with a lot of it. And that, again, that's why I would give him, maybe not a get out of jail card, but I do see that there was a noble intent behind some of the early so-called postmodernist thinkers, or the ones who were the progenitors of that movement, because what they were trying to do, again, was fundamentally apply an analytical approach to looking at historical or literary dialogues. And that is useful. Make no mistake. The problem is when people think that in order to have a discussion about anything, we have to look at this sort of deeper subcurrent, this twilight language underlying everything that everyone is saying. And again, an example that I've actually had people do with me is that I'll say something, anything in the context of this conversation we're having, and they'll say, but Micah's a Southerner. Now let's look at the entire history of, racism. In
Right, exactly.
And then they'll try and filter everything I have said. By the way, a person who's extraordinarily passionate about all issues pertaining to individual rights, freedoms, liberty. I'm a person who, again, you can call me libertarian in that truest sense of I am an advocate for people's rights and their freedoms. And I take it personally when people try to filter. Not that it happens often, I'm just saying that it has happened because it's an example of what we're discussing here, to try and take someone's entire, anything that they've said and filter it through the history of a region where they exist, or the history of a church that they go to, or the history of a university that they teach at or that they attended. Again, that's the problem, is that people will weaponize or find a way to weaponize everything through this sort of filtration of ideas in search of a hidden meaning. And the best, I'll leave you with this one so we can move on to other things. The best one that comes to mind was Herman Melville and Moby Dick. The literary critics later come on and talk about this incredible, deeper sub-narrative, about what the whale represented. Melville goes, actually, I didn't mean any of that. It was really just a story about a whale. So the critics then go, but the thing is that you probably weren't aware of it. It was subliminal. It was subconscious, but you meant it even though you didn't know it. And then finally, he kind of starts going, hell, maybe I really did mean that and didn't know it. It's when you are convinced that you had actually thought something that you didn't think that you thought when you wrote it. That's where the problem comes from. And that's kind of a great analogy for it, because not only are some of these people going so deep in their revisionist ideas and their deconstructionist ideas, but they're getting other people to buy into that hype, and it's created a whole new form of dialogue. So rather than the so-called straw man argument where it's like, this person seems to be saying this and they appear to think this, again, and this is something Eric Weinstein has advocated, if you want to maintain intellectual honesty in a discussion and make sure that you aren't misplacing the thoughts and ideas of an individual, what you do is you'd say, Richard, so let me explain it to you like this. Okay, you have just said, and I want to make sure I understand. Then I would explain it to you. And then when you agree that I have understood and interpreted what you said properly, then we move forward with dialogue from that. And that is a steel man argument. I'm an advocate of the steel man, not the straw man.
Yeah, I think that I like the way you put that. And it's not that there aren't, as I was saying before, there aren't subliminal or other psychological motivations behind what we do and say. Melville may very well have been tapping into other kinds of themes that he was not aware of when he wrote Moby Dick. Entirely, I would say it's probably likely. We all have deep psychological currents working within us that we are often unaware of. So that's fair. And to that extent, it would be legitimate, you might say, to try to deconstruct, as it were, someone's text and try to look for other currents, as it were, that are going in a text and in someone's work. Having said that, what's happened is that it's gone to such an extent that it's taken precedence over the actual narrative that authors and speakers are saying, and that's dangerous. That undermines the common consensus of what we have in terms of language itself, and is very, very dangerous. I would like, in the last, we had about 15 minutes before the end of this hour, I'm very, we talked about Jordan Peterson, and I got into Jordan Peterson a couple of years ago, just as he was starting to kind of blow up as a cultural figure. Back then, and these are still available, there were lots of his classroom lectures that were on YouTube, and they're just fascinating. And he gives advice, really, in my view, that I think is very, very logical, very common sense for men and women. He's not just for guys. I totally disagree with that. But what I guess I'm getting into this. I have two children who are in university right now. And I'm always interested in asking them, my daughter in particular, she's in a much more of a kind of a social environment, I think, where she is. I'm always trying to get a sense of what are people in their 20s and universities thinking about? What are they doing? And the very, very strong impression that I've got is that a large percentage of university students, young people in their 20s, have been so utterly poisoned by this. It's a form of totalitarian, left progressivism that brooks no opposition, and that really has given up this idea of a genuine freedom of speech. One of the most important things that I've heard Jordan Peterson say in the years that I've been listening to him is on the value of freedom of speech. And he said this a number of times. He said, free speech is not just like any other right. He describes it as the foundation of a truly healthy society. It is the ultimate corrective that we require to make ourselves better. If I don't give you the right to disagree with me in a civil discourse, then I'm not permitting myself to be corrected when I need to be corrected. And the only way that we become better is by listening to other people and who have critiques of what we have to say and do. And if we don't allow that, if we deplatform people that we say are hateful or that we disagree or that we smear as racist or nationalist or whatever, then we're doing ourselves a disservice. Last thing I want to say is my suspicion, and this is my conspiratorializing coming through here. I think that the left progressive movement has been completely allowed to do this really work for a kind of globalist elite. They are doing the work of the globalist elite because what 21st century globalization is all about is destroying boundaries between nations, destroying categories, and destroying old structures that have existed. And that is precisely what the so-called progressive left is about. They're about destroying categories of nationality. They're about destroying old categories, even of gender and race and so forth. Well, actually, not of race. They've really solidified. They've kind of created a kind of new racism, actually. But they're destroying categories of gender, sex, nationality, and much more, sexuality. So by doing that, they're really paving the way for a kind of for a new globalization that destroys traditional national sovereignty. And what that will do is it will destroy the ability of ordinary people to have any kind of agency in the political institutions of their society.
Right.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. Well, where do we begin? Coming back, I'm going to dive in on free speech, okay? You look at the effects of free speech on a society like ours, and it is the ability for people to get out there and strongly oppose a president of the United States like Donald Trump, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not making a statement for or against Trump, by the way. I'm saying, again, you see the people and the numbers, of the marches, right? Whether it's a movement like Me Too, it doesn't matter what it is. I mean, you look at how much dissent among the press, among the citizenry, and then you compare that to Tiananmen Square in China in 1986, where the government literally sees students marching as such a threat that they impose martial law and start shooting. You think about, for instance, the death of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi recently.
Yeah, right.
Okay, a guy who wrote, ladies and gentlemen, wrote in the Washington Post as a dissident, basically, and criticizing Saudi Arabia. And this man was beaten to death and dismembered in a consulate in Turkey, a Saudi Arabian consulate. So, I mean, this is the effects that are far less often emphasized, I think, over here in the West. These are the things that happen in parts of the world where free speech is not an honored tradition and a right that all people should have. Do we really want as a society to move in a direction where there is less of it? Because we see what happens when people are not guaranteed that right. And that
very
liberty.
Good point. Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, so that's the thing is, I think, and this is a point that a lot of the guys in the so-called intellectual dark web have argued, is that when we're talking about postmodernism and the control of language and the control of ideas and the weaponization of terms and things like this, people don't seem to ever look at Stalin or Mao and look at the atrocities that occurred under similar systems of control, whether they were intellectual control or actual overt control in a government as imposed by a regime. And so, again, that's why for me, and something I've always appreciated about you, you have a background academically as a historian, and you always kind of propel your arguments forward with a knowledge of history. And that's something I try to do too, although I'm an amateur, an avocationalist in that regard, you might say. But we can't forget the past, but we can't just look at our past, because we forget. And I think that, everybody wants to talk about privileges, privileged society. This person's more privileged than that person. Well, the privilege of living in the Western world is that, we complain about the first or the 1%, but the top 10% of all the wealthiest people in all the world live in America. Live in the Western world. We always forget about the impoverished people in nations where literally they can live for an entire year off of $8, and they don't live well, let me tell you. I mean, we are so privileged, and yet we are blind to it. So let's talk about a little relativism as it relates to that. I mean, people forget when they get out there and they are protesting and they are angry and they're just engaged in flame wars on Twitter and Facebook. They completely forget how privileged we are to live in this modern world of the West that we have built. And to recognize those freedoms and those privileges is the first step toward realizing the bigger problems that we face as team civilization. That's my opinion.
I agree. But the thing about privilege, I just want to say that there is no legal definition of privilege. It's not a tangible thing. There is a tangible understanding of rights. So I don't have privileges, or if I do, they're not tangible. I do have rights, and as do other people. And I think that's the language that we're really better off speaking about, but on the left, you don't really hear that at all. I just have to say, I think the so-called progressive social justice movement it has become, 35 plus years ago, I was a young guy, and I remember the rise of the Christian right, the moral majority, the fundamentalists. We're talking 1980, 81. I was 18, 19 years of age back then. And I looked at them. I was very afraid of them. I was very disturbed by that movement. I saw them as a kind of anti-freedom movement as I looked at it at the time. And they had they never achieved total ascendancy in American society, but they did have a very powerful position during the Reagan years for a good 5, 6, 7 years, I would say. And they kind of waned by the late 1980s, and then kind of became backwater. And I could never have predicted. I could never have predicted that I would be more afraid of the social justice movement and see them as more totalitarian than the Christian right was 35 years ago. But that's what the social justice movement has done to me, and I look at them with absolute terror. And, a lot of these young people, not only are they totalitarian in their wanting to be language police and thought police, but many of them, a number of them anyway, openly seem to support communist leaders like Mao and Stalin. I mean, they're out there, and I just think, have these people, well, clearly they know nothing about history. They know nothing. But if one were to talk to them about the crimes, the monstrous crimes of Mao and of Stalin and these other totalitarian leaders, what a lot of these young people would say. They'd be like, well, that's just your narrative. That's just your interpretation of it. And because that's what
last time I checked, last time hundreds of thousands of people died.
Millions. But the postmodernists, this has been the poison of postmodernism. It has encouraged an enormous group of people to look at facts as just another narrative. And this is so that there is no pretense of objectivity. It's all just someone's narrative, and all narratives have to do with, maintaining your power over others, and that's the only thing. And it's such my God, I'm trying to be accurate without losing my emotional control here, but it's a very, very destructive. It's a destructive psychologically and socially way to look at truth. There is truth. There is truth.
And I think again that idea of relativism, has been taken to such an illogical extreme that the people who are such strong advocates of it don't realize how culturally relative their own perspective is. I mean, it's almost like they are in orbit around common sense, and they are no longer even a part of it. I'll leave you with this quote, okay, from our good friend Nietzsche. All right, it is not conflict of opinions that has made history so violent, but conflict of belief in opinions. That is to say, conflict of convictions. And I think that says a lot because people, it's not so much their opinion, it's their belief in that opinion. It's the things that, and in that sense, the reason I quote him here, you're absolutely right to make a comparison between the fundamentalist thought that was prevalent among the Christian right in the early 1980s and the rise in a belief system that is now being built around postmodernism by, in truth, a very highly indoctrinated youth that doesn't even know how to define it, let alone understand the motives behind it. And they are no less indoctrinated into that cult of belief, that cult of personality, cult of culture. Mm-hmm. And it has now become its own language and its own movement for them. And yeah, they are almost just like the religiosity, I guess, that people feared decades. Not that the religionist was bad. It was the political attitudes that seemed to be associated with a very fundamentalist worldview. Right. And the political left, in the extreme left, again, I'm an advocate of liberalism, and I also have very good friends of the conservative ideology. But if any side goes to an extreme, it seems that that's where fundamentalism lies, and therefore totalitarianism and all kinds of other things seep in.
Oh yeah, I agree with you, and I don't know if I'm liberal or conservative. It's a hard thing for me to characterize myself.
Don't be either.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I grew up as a young person, always just reflexively seeing myself as a left-ish progressive, but I didn't really sit down and think that one. I didn't really think about what that meant, and it's only been the last decade of just being beaten over the head by the finger-wagging, sermonizing, moralistic thought police on the left that I've really gotten to be so annoyed with them, and really it's woken me up to the dangers and the threats that they pose to our society. And so I'm definitely not a fan of them. And I think that infection has gone into all areas of our society. We started this hour off by talking about the idea of someone like Corey Goode to try to trademark certain phrases and make them presumably off limits for other people to use, or at least to monetize. And even that's bad enough. You should be able to monetize SSB if you want to. Why the hell not? Anyone should be allowed to. That's not something that anyone should be allowed to monopolize. Who the hell is he to think that he can do that? All right, well, look, we're at the end of the hour, man. I want just people to know that you and I are going to continue this for a chat on my website, and you're going to put this on yours as well, I believe. And by the way, tell people what your site is so they can go to it.
Well, I have 3 of them. Well, actually, even more than that, so we'll just go down the list very quickly. MicahHanks.com, my personal website. All my other information is there. But relative to this conversation, people might want to check out my podcast, Middle Theory, which is at middletheory.com. Richard has been a guest on that show. We discuss news, current events, politics, ideas.
It. Yeah, loved it.
Yeah, and we're going to have you back on again, too, by the way. But then, of course, right here on KGRA Radio, you'll also find the Gralien Report on Monday nights, or at gralienreport.com. Check out all those sites, and definitely MicahHanks.com for even more, because there's other stuff out there we just haven't got time to get into.
Fabulous. Well, listen, let's wrap it here for now, Micah. I just want to thank listeners for listening in. Micah, thank you so much for being on this segment of the Richard Dolan Show. And just remember, to hear Micah and I continue our conversation, go to my website, richarddolanmembers.com, where Micah and I are going to get into a couple of other things. We're going to talk about TTSA's $37 million debt, and we're going to talk about your research into NASA's UFO documentation from the Aviation Safety Reporting System, I believe. I really want to get into that with you. A word on this new format of the Richard Dolan Show. I know that for years the entire 2-hour broadcast was made available for listeners, particularly in those days when nearly all of the shows I did were solo, just me and my thoughts and research. So what I've been doing starting in 2018 is to continue that format in the form of 2 weekly live stream programs each week: Intelligent Disclosure, which I do every Tuesday night with my wife Tracy, and UFOs The Big Picture, which I do every Saturday. Those 2 programs are the places now where I put the bulk of my solo-oriented content, and I always make those freely available on my YouTube channel. It has always been my commitment to share substantial amounts of information with the general public. I'm just moving some of the pieces around. The very best way to stay current with what I'm up to these days is by subscribing to my newsletter. It's free, it's easy, and it goes to your mailbox every week. Go to Richard Dolan Members or to my Facebook page, Richard Dolan Intelligent Disclosure, and you're all set. Thanks for listening. And remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Later.